Hi, everybody. My name is Sunny Boy, Ahmar, or Prof Nomad. Not Professor Nomad, it's Prof Nomad, and it's the Nomad Professor. Okay. And today I'll be talking about Caliban X, Amplifying Subaltern Practice. And this is a keynote address that I've recorded for the International Conference on Recentering Indigenous Thought in the Age of Decolonialism and Technology for the Islamic International University in Islamabad. First of all, let me apologize for not being there in person with you today. And part of the reason is because I am actually in far north Queensland today and at the time of this conference. And the reason is because my granddad passed away a couple of weeks ago, and I'm here for his funeral. As you will see, granddad was only 58 years old. So not very old at all in terms of numbers. And so we must wonder, why is it that indigenous peoples around the world, including in Australia, tend to have much shorter lifespans and life expectancy than the Anglo-Australians or the other Anglo populations in their occupied lands. Let me read this poem, and of course, today's session and this poem is dedicated to Granddad Brumby or Granddad Andrew. And it's a poem that I wrote based on a conversation with him and other elders a few years ago. And so let me read it to you. I asked Auntie Brumby, how can humans own other lives? She replied, humans developed a mental disease. They now chase goals that are infinite. Without an end, they are lost. Yet they believe they are intelligent. Granddad Brumby added, yes, lost are they in their ways, thinking they own us and Mother Earth, when they themselves are a creature that emerged only a while ago. Granddad Crocodile spoke from distance. Their evolution is yet incomplete. Perhaps they will see sense, or else, I guess, we will witness another species extinction. Wise words from Granddad Andrew. Rest well, Granddad. The infrastructures that shaped Granddad's life and the lives of so many of us around the world are not neutral. And they're all around us in all aspects of our lives. Just think about how much time we spend writing grant applications, different kinds of reports, doing reviews for journals, all unpaid. Writing for journals, unpaid. Who's making the money? The journals, the publishers. They make billions in profits. While us, the authors, the people who do the work to create the work, mostly get nothing out of it. And yet, we belong to this publish or perish culture. We're always trying to publish all the time because that's what's required of us. So notice how the infrastructure around us, the regimes, the requirements, the protocols, require us to do certain things in certain ways. Because if we don't get a job. We don't get a promotion. So we're stuck. So we have to do things. And so we do them. And with what consequences? Here's one. I'll let you read it for a second. Let it sink in. So, of all the work that we do, on an average, this is an average, remember, some papers don't get any readers at all. and some get a lot. So when you average things out, it's actually doesn't mean that every paper gets that number of readers. But if you were to average everything out, it's around 10. But that's, again, a lot of it is hidden there with the average. Notice 82% of the articles published in humanities are not cited even once for the 5 years after they are published. Even more worrying, only 20% of those have been read. So 82% never get cited, 18% get cited. Of the 18%, only 20% have been read. So people who are writing these papers and citing other papers have not read the papers they're citing. That's what it means. Half of academic papers are never read by anybody other than maybe the peer reviewers and the editors. Authors, I'm hoping that they do. Although in this world of AI generation, I'm starting to see papers submitted where I wonder if the author has actually read what they're submitting. So this is the world we live in. We're publishing. So much of your time, everybody's time goes into these publications, which we know is not easy. Writing is not easy. Getting published is not easy. We know I mean, this is an open secret around corruption, around publication. We know what happens around these things. I don't want to name names or name things. These are shameful activities that happen around gatekeeping in terms of who gets published in journals around the world and what kind of journals. And why? Because of the requirements. So notice the infrastructural requirements that people to move from being a student to getting a job, you must get a publication. From being a lecturer to an assistant professor, or from assistant professor to associate professor, or from associate professor to professor, you need to have more publications. So notice how the infrastructure is creating these needs. So in this context, if we continue to write these papers, what it implies is that we can keep writing and we can keep speaking, but nobody is listening. The stats that I just shared tell us people are not reading, people are not listening. People are writing papers, citing other papers without reading what they're citing. So when these kind of questions become issues in reality, then the idea of speaking doesn't make sense anymore. So it's not that Caliban speaks. Caliban can speak as much as he likes, or she likes, or they like. Caliban can speak. Does it make any difference? Notice how many papers are published on decolonization, how many papers are published in critical theory, critical applied linguistics, critical discourse analysis, revealing to us the plethora of problems that exist. And yet, the problems keep getting worse. So, speaking is not sufficient. What is needed is action. Because we only have the present moment. Our present moment can be spent speaking, which I'm doing, by the way, right now, or acting, which for me is also what I'm doing right now. It is an action, it is a performance, it's a recording of a session that people will listen to later on. So it is an action that I'm doing, but notice it is based on a speech in this context. A speech in this particular context is doing something, which is it's recording a talk which is meant for you. But notice how much speech in academia is just speech. It's written for nobody. Nobody's reading it. It's written for the authors to get a promotion. So notice the motivation behind writing is to get a promotion. It's a pretty selfish motive. So notice the motive behind it. तो अपनी बोली में कहते हैं ना आमाल क्या आमाल का दारोमदार नियत पर है. तो जब नियत ही साफ नहीं है नियत में तो अपने आप को प्रमोशन दिलाना है, अपने आप की पीएचडी करना है, ये हमारी नियत है। तो जब नियत सही नहीं है तो अमाल फिर उसका नतीजा सही नहीं होगा ना। So what I'm saying in Boli, in our Boli, there's a concept of niyat, which means that you have to have an intentionality in what you do. So any act that you perform, the intentionality has to be part of it. So if the intentionality of doing research at the moment is to get a promotion or to get a PhD, then obviously the intentionality or the niyat is one which is pretty selfish. And so obviously the kind of outcomes that you're expecting are also pretty selfish. So individuals get jobs, individuals get promotions, but the rest of the community, the real people in the real communities who really need support from academics and the brains of the society are not getting the benefits they should be getting because we're stuck writing papers that nobody is reading. So we need to move from speech and speaking to acting, to creating resources, to creating things, to creating the materials that we need in order to progress and develop and harmonize our environments and our societies. So this infrastructure that I'm talking about, it's not just the content. It's the various platforms, the genres, the templates, the interfaces, the metrics, everything that organizes credibility and action. These are all aspects of the infrastructure. And I will give you specific examples of how this works in a few minutes. So English and global Englishes, if we want to say it, are critical in how all of this operates. And the reason is because they provide the foundational categories and classificatory systems and the terminologies and the relationship between the different categories that are crucial for any kind of social, governmental, or any other kind of planning or policy work that's done. So the grammar of the English language is crucial in how people around the world experience life and live their lives. And not just people, the rest of the environment as well. Because the English grammar dictates the kind of policies that are created, which are enabled by the grammar of the English language. And now this is stuff that we will talk about in other places. Here, I won't spend as much time on it. So what we want to do though, and this is something that we can all do, is learn to take something as simple as let's say a conference form, right? So you are all at a conference, so which means you submitted maybe an abstract or enrolled at the conference. So when you submitted your abstract, you had to put your names, your affiliations, keywords, abstracts, all of these things. Notice that is the template for putting in, or that's the genre that you need to know in order to write the abstract so that it will be accepted at the conference and so you can be here and present your work. So notice how the infrastructure is in English, the genres and the templates and the interfaces are in English, and the terminology, therefore, is English. Now, as we will see later on, sometimes terminology does not actually translate from one language to the other. And as we will also talk about later on, when we use AI technologies to translate things from English into other languages, very often there is a semantic flattening, and I will talk about it again in a bit, which leads to misinterpretation and therefore eventually misanalysis and has a very huge cost. So these are all things that we also need to consider. So here we will do is we will start to look at how we can take little things, the artifacts, the micro artifacts are the things, the items, like the form that you filled in, and how that connects to the routines. For example, when you send in your abstract, there's the committee that will review your abstract, and that committee will review your abstract based on certain criteria. And so that criteria then becomes part of the meso routine, right? And this is all informed by the macro regimes, right? The macro regimes might be the policies, the institutional policies, the language policies, whatever the larger regime policies are that shape the other things, right? So if your macro regime policy is we need research-based presentations at this conference, then your meso pathway, your abstracts will all have to be research-based. So then research is prioritized through the meso process because that's the macro regime. So research, 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 not community work, not other collaborative things that we do in our everyday life, but research, research, research. So notice the macro regime is pushing for research of a particular kind. So then when you go into the meso, which you go into the abstracts submission forms for conferences, you see research as being something that is pushed into our lives. We have to carry out research. So we have to write research grants, we have to write research proposals, and all of this is based on finding the gap in research, right? So your idea is to find a gap in research, and then you research that gap, and then you write your research paper about that gap, and then you publish that research paper, and the gap it still exists, right? Nothing actually happens except for some words exchanging here and there. Nothing changes. And this is where we will stop thinking about things as the way are happening, and really thinking about maybe if our macro regimes were, maybe we want to create a positive change within our communities. Our agenda, our macro agenda is we want to create environmental stabilization in places where we live. In Pakistan, we really need to think about population. What is population? Why is it that the rates of population are increasing so fast? I recently published a paper on how socio-semiotics relates to population growth, and how a country like Pakistan specifically needs to look into these things to decrease the growth of rate of population growth, so that the country can stabilize the population in relation to the environment and everything else and the economy. So you can see how all of these things are interconnected. We're not just talking about language as something is a grammar that we study, but we're really looking at how our societies are organized and how they relate to each other or how they function. And if we start to see this, we will start to see it's not just a scale, but there's a recursion, which means things are repeated and organized again and again and again in the same pattern. So it's not simple repetition. It's actually a repetition of a particular logic, right? So it's a recursion of the logic that you see at many different spaces. So for example, once we have identified research as being the thing that we want to promote, then you see that in the meso levels, of course, and in the conferences, not just one conference, every conference will pretty much do that. FLC, by the way, does not. We do encourage non-research-based submissions, but that's, of course, because we are aware of what happens through these processes. And we want to open up alternatives. So creating alternatives is something we will talk about again in today's session, because that is where Caliban acts. Its action is in the creation of the alternatives. So what we see in recursion is the repetition of these patterns again and again and again. This recursion can happen within the artifacts or at the same level or across different levels. And there we do account for different types of recursions. And then, of course, which is fine, the scale and recursion happens everywhere, and it's okay by itself. There's nothing wrong with it. That's just how systems operate. Where things start getting odd, and this is where we need to sort of really start thinking about in terms of creating practices, not a speech, not dialogue, but not just chit chat, but materials and resources, is through by looking at what is erased through the system. Because what erasure tells us is not that something is missing. It's not missing information. It's erasure is when something has been cancelled, it's been deleted out of the system. It just doesn't exist in the system anymore. So, for example, the Australian legal system, even though it's a settler colony, these are occupied lands, and the Aboriginal populations like Grandad Andrew and the mobs around Australia still exist and live on land, and they have their own laws and they have their own traditions. Those laws, the Aboriginal laws, which do vary across the country, the big, massive continent, those laws do not actually inform the infrastructure of Australian law. right? So the Australian law is based on the British legal system because Australia is Commonwealth, right? It is still connected to the monarchy and to the UK in different ways. So when we see how again these systems operate and where the erasure happens, so what the erasure does is that it takes away the Aboriginal laws and customs in determining social and laws and policies of Australia, which is what I meant, how Aboriginal communities and Indigenous communities are systematically ostracized and excluded from other aspects of life. And so even though the Australian government likes to talk about closing the gap, what we see on the ground is actually a widening of the gap, not a narrowing, a widening of the gap. And that's something that really needs to be thought around. And part of the reason that this widening happens is that we have this erasure embedded across different disciplines, not just linguistics, across different disciplines and ways of doing things in governance, in governments, in education, in research, in universities, in education, in all the various aspects of life and society. We have these erasures built into the system. And then these recur at scale. And so as a consequence of it, many of us feel the exclusion and the oppression and the continuous struggle without necessarily seeing any benefits, right? So one of the things that I always tell people around whoever I talk to is that people from our part of the world, the subaltern often work very hard. They often work harder than the people who are not subaltern and have advantages. But they don't always get the same returns for the work they do. And that's another part, right? And that part, again, is because a lot of their labor and what they have to do is erased. It's not recognized within the system. So all the double labor and the triple labor that people have to put in when they are subaltern is not considered part of our labor at all. So again, notice how the scale, recursion, and erasure work together with each other. And we can enter this analysis, analytical pathway. It's really an analytical pathway. At any point, we can come into the analytical pathway from macro or micro or meso, or we might note some recursion patterns, or we might note, hey, where's the Aboriginal culture represented here in the legal system? And then you work your way through it. So your entry points might be different. What SRE does, it shows the various relationships, and so that you can look up and down the scale, you can look at recursion and identify erasure. So it becomes a very useful methodology in order to identify where the erasures are. And we need to do this because, in a sense, once we know where the erasures are, like we're talking about in research, the erasure is the constant push for research. The erasure is of practices, of doing things, of creating things, of all the other things that we do in life that are not considered research, right? So that's all erased because of this framework. So we've seen this, we've studied it, and so which means now that we can then start thinking about how to create alternatives, how to create things that can help us redress the kind of issues and problems that we have identified. Now, before we do that, let's look at a few more examples of SRE. So I think I've already given you this example of conference submission forms, right? So the micro requires specific fields. The meso has a particular screening procedure. And if you don't meet any of the criteria in that procedure, you will not be included. So, of course, some of these procedures are okay and they should be there, right? So we're not saying that every form of removing things is discrimination or bad. It's not. Sometimes we need to remove things for the system to work. Sometimes we need to remove things because the consequences of not removing might not be what we want. So there might be various reasons for including or not including things. And it's not always necessarily out of malice. There could be good, genuine reasons, but at the same time, it could be things that are essentially discriminatory, in underlying discriminatory practices based on race, gender, religion, ethnicity, social class. There's so many different things that people discriminate based on. could be any of those factors. If it's built into the system, then it means that we starting to erase certain identities, and the consequences of it become severe. So, for example, in the case of Pakistan, where this conference is, we can, for example, notice the shift in the relationship between the gender types in South Asia across, say, the last few hundred years. Now, generally, I don't like to talk about history because history is a very, it's a funny area. It can be easily manipulated for various reasons. But also, in other cases, there is a reason sometimes that we might want to look into specific aspects going into the past to see how certain things might have worked in certain ways. So, for example, with gender relationships in South Asia, as not unlike other parts of Southeast Asia and East Asia, there were more than two genders, right? So Khwaja Sira, right? So Mard Aurat or Khwaja Sara. So we have three gender classifications, which, by the way, is now again the legal system. So the three gender classification system is the legal system in Pakistan again. It was reintroduced a decade or so ago, and is now again the law. So when I'm saying again and again, and why is it again? It's because in the late 1800s, during the British Raj, the British actually criminalized the third gender. So notice what happens, right? So this is infrastructure. So the English recognizes two genders grammatically, males and females, masculine, feminine, right? So you've got two genders in English that translates into policy, which means two genders in the policies. So you either have males or you have females, and there is no options otherwise. So the forms and the categories relate to the infrastructure, which is shaped by the language. And then, of course, all the forms will always have males and females. So that is the only options you have. So either you fit yourself into that category, or you don't exist. So notice how these forms and things can actually create social impact. And so this is what I meant. It's legal again. But of course, for over 100 years, there was huge oppression on the third gender. And of course, if late 1800s is when the British passed specific laws and regulations prohibiting the third gender, including, for example, third gender lost its right to owning property or having an inheritance, losing inheritance, right? So all of a sudden, they had nothing from having everything to becoming, essentially penniless overnight, because the British system did not recognize the third gender because it's not part of the infrastructure. So you see here that we are connecting various different things, but they are not independent of each other. They are interconnected. And as part of our communities and societies, we experience these things in life. So people from the third gender still get discriminated in the country. I don't need to tell you, you guys who live in Pakistan, who have been to Southeast Asia, South Asia, you've seen it, the kind of experiences people have if they identify with the third gender. So, and a lot of these things go back to the issues around infrastructure. So here we are looking at a conference form, but you can see then again the recursion, right? So the recursion of this happens not just in this particular field, but happens at different scales, at the macro, meso, and micro across different sites. Different educational context, different textbooks, resources, everything, right? So when you have this constant, bombardment of information, semiotic information bombarding us of a particular kind, we have really no way to escape that semiotic, sort of chains that are thrown around us very, very early on in our lives. And so coming out of those chains is a practice. It's not a speech. If you understand decolonization, it's not something you can actually talk about. It's only something you can perform and do. So it's an action. It's Caliban acts, right? That's very important for us to remember today. Okay, so moving on to another example, it's not just the naming conventions, but again, thinking around journals, thinking about publications, even though it's a conference in Pakistan at an Islamic university, English is the language of most of the conferences. And even though मैंने थोड़ी बोली थी, मगर नोट कीजिए मैं फौरन वापस अंग्रेजी में आ गया. अभी भी दोबारा बोली में आया, फिर अंग्रेजी में चला जाऊंगा. ठीक है, क्यों? क्योंकि because the kind of infrastructure that we are operating in requires English in a certain way. If you write a bilingual paper and submit it to a journal, even if it's a journal about linguistics, about applied linguistics, if you write the article itself bilingually, they will not accept it, right? Because not because they don't think the paper is not good, it's because the infrastructure doesn't have a space for it, right? The same paper will allow you to use other languages as examples. So you can write a paper for a journal in applied linguistics and linguistics. The paper itself has to be in English of a particular kind, and then you can use examples from other languages, other parts of the world. That's all right. That's okay. But you cannot make the paper itself multilingual, right? You cannot have parts of the paper, like the introduction, part of introduction is starting in, let's say, Urdu, and then part shifting halfway into Pashto, and then shifting halfway into Gujarati, and then moving into Bangla, and then into Hindi, into English. If you write a paper like this, once it's hard to write a paper like this, but if you write it, the journals will mostly not accept it because they expect English. Even though the journal is about language, a journal is about applied linguistics, it still excludes. So think about the rest of the other fields, the amount of exclusion in the other fields, it's overwhelming, right? So when you see these things, and when you see how then, of course, in reviews in meta-analysis, if everything is English as a filter, what we start seeing is that any kind of work in English, any kind of work, it doesn't have to be good work, any kind of work in English is going to be visible, but the work in our Boli is not. So let me repeat this. Any work in English doesn't have to be good work. Any work in English is going to be part of the infrastructure, and it's going to be available. So any English, doesn't matter if it's good English or appropriate English or what it is, doesn't matter. It's okay as long it's not a language other than English. Notice how the system excludes anything other than English. So when you create these systems, and then of course in the world of AI, with the trainings being done on English mostly, then the AI genres get translated within technological worlds as well. So you can imagine the potential implications of it at that scale again, because that's again an issue of scale, right? So we need to consider these things. And as I said, once we have identified these things, we cannot stop there. We have to move from critique to redesign. If the problems are infrastructure, then we need to create alternative infrastructure. If it's the problem is if it's a particular artifact or a form, fix the form. Fixing the form is the easiest thing to do, especially if the form is online. Notice FLC website, conference website does not differentiate between last name and first name. We just ask for name. Your choice, whatever your name is, right? We don't determine that it must be first name, middle name, last name, or must have a suffix. No, that's up to you, because we recognize that different parts of the world have different naming conventions. In parts of the world, people just have a single name. That's it. Well, again, we won't go much into naming, but looking into naming and naming conventions itself across the world is a fascinating area to explore cross-culturally. So we'll then talk about the amplifier, which is a way to create that alternative that we have been talking about. And of course, we create alternatives in the spaces that we operate. So the kind of problems that I was sharing with you, the problems with publication and the industry with the publication, because I'm an associate professor and I've been working with FLC for years, I have the space to be able to create some kind of infrastructure to alter the kind, or to provide an alternative for people to publish in, which responds to and avoids the kind of problems that you see in other mainstream publications. So we will look through this in a second. And as we look through this, I want you to pay attention to a few things, like, for example, see how, for example, There is a lot of discussions, conversations happening in the discussion board where I've actually been encouraging my students to watch these videos, learn from them, write comments in the comment board. So I'm actually training my students to engage with and provide feedback in a professional and courteous manner. And then, of course, this feedback becomes useful for the authors who will then use it later on. We're still not in the process of revisions at this point in time. We're still reviewing the various submissions, and you're welcome to be part of this process. We encourage you to watch the videos and respond to the comments that have already been made, but also write directly to the authors, give them feedback. Because they want your input, right? This is scholarship in practice, and let me just change, stop sharing screen here, and share a different screen with you. Uh, right, where you can now see this is the table of contents for the amplifier. And you will see there's a range of different things, right? So let's, Alabal Ali Mulai is a song. It's in Shina language. A love tale of Putri Seri Gurmon, designing accessible anti-fraud communication for elderly communities in Bayangxiang. Uh, so you can see education and the treasure of tranquility, French in commercial science in United Arab Emirates, Quen Tomasino, lessons in cleanliness, smiles for the future, no shame in menstruation, pageantria, Pakistani English, an analysis of morphosyntactic and phonological features in cricket commentary, Pangamsa, language in the craft, self-identity, reconstruction of ADHD adult. So you can see there's so many different things, and you can already see there are different kinds of presentations and recordings. There is a songs, there's a making of the frog rivers, there's a games, a discussion of games, right? The Nushu cipher, for example, is a game for learning and teaching a writing script. And you will see all of these postings have, there's, yeah, you can either watch it on YouTube or you can watch it on Bilibili. And depending on the submission, I'll show you some others here. We have a range of other options available. So for example, if we go to, I think it is this one. Digital indigenous related stories as tools for language and cultural learning by Shinyi Chu from University of Malaya. Now notice here, it also comes with click to download a resource pack with adaptable activities for undergraduate and postgraduate teaching, language learning, and self-community or learning. So notice a lot of these videos come with material for teaching and learning available for others. Uh, so this is part of the design. So it's actually material that we encourage the authors to write. In this case, because Shin is teaching at University of Malaya, and she's getting her students to create stories. So we have two other stories, The Love Tape of Putri Seri, and Today I Will Be Brave are actually her students' work. So you can see how the journal nests things. So you've got the lecturer's work and then the students' work. So we can see the whole package, right? And it's all audio-visual. Unlike in a journal paper, which will only be the lecturer and the student's work doesn't actually appear, here the student's work also gets published and recognized. And it's also getting reviewed. So for example, we already have a public review of this work by Barbara, who's done a fantastic job I'll just show you very briefly. Uh, right, so she's talking directly to the authors in her review, and she's going to she's going to watch the video with the reviewers, with anybody. You guys can watch this too, right? So she stops at various different points. And she will talk about different things in different aspects. And so you can notice how she's playing the video in the background as well, and she's pausing at various points in time. Now, This review itself can, of course, also be used for educational purposes. So I'm now working on how training my students to read the reviews, watch the reviews, and avoid the kind of things that the reviewers are talking about in their own projects. So it becomes part of a public pedagogy, right? So it's no longer just something that happens behind closed doors. And notice the reviewers, it's not blind review, no double blind review or anything. The authors and reviewers know each other because it's all public. And that is the strength of the journal, because when things are personal, that the reviewer is job no longer is to be the reviewer's job is no longer finding reasons to reject a paper, but the reviewer's job now is to help facilitate, mentor a colleague, a junior scholar, into developing something they have been working on into something that's better and more shareable. So notice here, at the moment, we are in table of contents issues table. We are still in drafts and reviews, right? So we don't have anything published at the moment. So once this review process has been finalized, once we move from the reviews onto the final publications, we will of course announce this through various channels. And I think at that point, we will also then open space for a next round of submissions. We are not actively recruiting submissions at the moment, but we will be at a later point in time. And so we will definitely encourage you to start thinking about the kind of submissions that you might want to make, especially credible projects, because credible projects start from identifying gap in practice, meaning a gap in the real world, instead of finding a gap in research. And just like a traditional research paper identifies a gap in research and then tries to respond to the gap in research, a credible project identifies a gap in practice and then tries to address that gap in practice by creating the appropriate resources that are needed for that. So let me just go back to my PowerPoint here and to wrap up our conversation. So this is not a regular keynote. I am going to give you guys homework. This homework has actually been released already. So some of you might have already received it. You might have already seen it. Others will see it now. And the first 25 submissions, if you email them to me, I will respond to you and engage with your submissions. And also, I will share the outputs in various outputs later on. So again, if you scan the QR code, it will take you here. I will show you what this looks like. So this is the SRE challenge. Can you trace how your own education excludes? So when you go here, it will tell you to first read a paper or to watch a recording of this talk right now. Right now, you can see it says link to be added. It's because I will add the link once I have uploaded this talk on these channels. And it says read this paper, listen to this talk. So the paper is here. It's this one that I wanted you to read first. It's called Global Englishes as Transmedia Infrastructure, Tracing Credibility, Erasure, and Redesign through SRE. That's Scale, Recursion, and Erasure Analysis. So the paper actually sets out why we are doing it. It explains all the sequences. It talks through and explains the examples that I have described here, some of the examples, but in much more detail because it is a written paper. So you can see there's a lot more discussion around what it is, a bit about amplifier, and then operationalization of it. So section 5 tells you how to actually do this work in your own contexts. So how can you apply SRE in where you are with the kind of materials around you, and then gives you more examples around it. And so what the SRE challenge then does, it actually kind of extends that chapter because that chapter is not a real chapter. It's a conference talk very much like this. And so what this activity, homework activity, the assignment does, it goes into a lot more detail into how to carry this out. So step by step. So the assignment here for you guys is to choose a course that you have taught or you teach or you have studied or you are studying right now, and then look through the reading lists that they have, look through the readings, and then go through the steps that I have identified here to see if there is erasure in your course, and if there is, then maybe something you can try to address. So it goes step by step. It tells you exactly the kind of things you need to do, what you are looking for. So for example, if you're looking at a course on social linguistics, because it's a conference on languages and linguistics, right? But this can be any discipline, right? So of course, each discipline has its own logic and its own grammar. But here we have, for example, reading one on social linguistics is classic Lebov 1966, the New York study. And then in week 3, there's a reading from Milroy and Milroy, also a classical study in social linguistics, looking at the application of some of these methods that Lebov developed in Belfast. And then we have Kachru in 86, then becomes another reading, which leads into world Englishes. Then he applies to world Englishes, again, the same idea of Lebovian social linguistics now is being applied to world Englishes, no longer discussed if it's appropriate theory or no longer. So the theory is no longer emerging. The theory has been taken and it's now being applied to a different context, which is world Englishes. So that is why a lot of the world Englishes literature out there is variationist in its orientation. It's because it derives from Lebovian variationist work. And of course, this all happens at the macro level, choices made at a macro level, which most academics are not aware of. So here we are, junior scholars, PhD students, myself included at one point in time, doing these studies, spending our time thinking we are doing some really clever work, is spending so much time writing these papers on Pakistani English, morphology of Pakistani English, phonology of Pakistani English. I'm guilty of writing these papers. I'm guilty. I know I've done it. I wish I hadn't, but I have. It is because I was at that point in time when I did not realize what the infrastructure was doing. But now I do know. And this is something we need to think about also. Once you know, do you continue doing what you did or do you change your direction? So these are important things for us to consider. So once you have world Englishes, where Kachru's ideas of world Englishes are now have naturalized variationist, everybody is just doing world Englishes around the world. Everybody is writing the same kinds of paper, morphological analysis of Tsunami's English, morphological analysis of Guyanese English, morphological analysis of Sudanese English, morphological analysis of Saudi English. All of these things, we're doing all of it because all of it comes from variationist work, which no longer is a debatable theory, because that theory has no longer is being contested. It's only being applied in a world English's context. So yes, we're getting these outputs, which are papers, but these papers have no real world implications. This is why nobody really reads them. That's why there is no real world impact. This is why we continue to publish papers, we continue to write grants, we continue to do PhDs, we continue to do research, and research, while the world around us visibly is getting worse. We have more violence, we have more environmental problems, everything is shaking up around us, and yet we live in this bubble where we think research is the only way out. So we need to stop. Caliban does not need to speak any longer. Caliban needs to act. So here I'm going to leave you with this challenge, and it's very detailed, and it states exactly what I told you. Some people stop here, they file the analysis and return to business as usual. That is their choice. Others refuse to work, others refuse to walk colonized paths once they can see them. So thank you very much, and I hope to see your submissions online. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.